How do you deal with the internal and external fears that create limitations in your life? Welcome to another episode of the Mental Health Break. In this episode, Hosai Mojaddidi joins me for a detailed discussion about the importance of understanding our fears at the root and to regain control of our lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Nafisa Sekandari, a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in anxiety-based disorders. I created the Mental Health Break podcast to give you simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies to help you prioritize your mental health. Mental illness can cost you time and money. Ignoring your symptoms will only make the problems worse. Taking time out of your busy day to dedicate to improving your mental health can lead to long-term health and wellness. In this podcast, each week you'll learn tips, tricks, and proven strategies to help you regain control of your life, all while prioritizing your mental health. If you want to improve your life, regain control of your mental health, and feel empowered, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by the Transforming Anxiety course, an online, self-paced anxiety course to help you manage and control your anxiety from the comfort, privacy, and convenience of your own home. Learn how to transform your anxiety in just 6 short weeks. Course registration is now open. To learn more, visit transforminganxiety.com/course.
So this topic today actually falls, really well under first self-awareness as well as self-regulation, because we're going to talk about identifying and clarifying what this concept of, these words, these that we're all very familiar with, right? Fears, anxieties, where they stem from. And how to notice those signs within ourselves, and then also how to manage those emotions, right? Because this is something that is very prevalent now. And Dr. Nafisa inshallah will go more into detail about that, but we know that anxiety disorders and just generalized anxiety are very common now, more so maybe than ever before, post-COVID certainly, but even before COVID, we did see this growing trend of more and more adults, especially here in the West, presenting with these types of symptoms. And so this is a topic we absolutely should address. Fear is part and parcel of this world, but we also need to differentiate between rational fear, irrational fear. What is fears that we all have subjectively, and then what are general fears that we should have, right? But then irrational fears, of course, are more subjective. I'm sure we've all seen different shows or people, different maybe even read articles where people who have fears of like random things. I think there was the Maury Povich show that he would bring people with it's not funny, but it's kind of amazing how unique we all are, because I have certain fears. I have a fear of water. I'm not very comfortable in bodies of water, like swimming and pools, even very shallow pools. I can have a really irrational fear to that. Whereas other people, it could be something like, I remember I've seen, I think, like balloons or even mustard, certain colors will bring out this real fear, and you can see it. People seem quite terrorized by those things. So these are all, some human experiences, and we should, of course, be understanding and compassionate with ourselves and with others when we're talking about these things. We should appreciate the other side of the coin, right? That these can, in fact, present because of environmental factors or other factors around us. So looking to what the clinical perspective is about these issues is also really important. So that's why we are very blessed to have Dr. Nafisa with us. For those of you who don't know her, I don't know how you don't know her, because so much of the work that I do is actually very much impacted by my experience with Nafisa personally. She is my first cousin, but also as a mentor. I have learned a lot from her for a good majority of my life. Mashallah, I always say that she's really been ahead of her time in many ways on these topics that now are becoming more and more common. She was an advocate for a lot of these things when it wasn't trending and wasn't popular. So I credit her for just getting us to think more deeply about our existence, life in general, and to really, as I said, in terms of mental health and being well in general, physical well-being, she's contributed a lot, mashallah. So I would advise all of you who don't know her to please follow her on Instagram. She's very active on Facebook. Do follow her work. And I'm going to now stop, and I will formally invite Dr. Nafisa to come to the stage and let us know what prompted you to discuss this. What prompted you to make a big focal point of your work on anxiety and fear. If you would please kindly let us know.
Thank you, Hosai, for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. First, I have a history of anxiety myself. My life has been limited by fear for a long time. And so I remember even when I was 19 years old, I was so tired of being controlled by my fears that I literally made a goal that my 19th year was going to be my last year that I was going to be controlled by fear. And I made it a goal to overcome as many fears as I could. And so I went up and I rappelled off the side of a mountain. And I remember I was in college and I allowed this huge snake to wrap itself around my neck. And I took swimming classes because like Hosai, I was totally terrified of swimming. I remember somebody in high school threw me in water as a joke one day. And I remember being so panicked, I wanted to die. And it took me a while to realize that everybody was saying, just stand up. And I had no idea that I was in only 3 feet of water and I could have just stood up. But that's how fear can be so debilitating. But what I'm finding out, and the reason I've specialized in anxiety for my career as a psychologist, is not only because of my own experience with fear limiting my life, but also seeing how so many people, fear is a silent killer of dreams. You know, a lot of people, millions of millions of people have dreams and they have goals and they have aspirations, and they know if it only wasn't just for the fear, they could accomplish so much more. And that's how I felt. My 20s were totally angst ridden. I was so full of fear about everything. Even though my goal was to overcome all my fears by before I turned 20, I did push myself to try different things, which is kind of like exposure therapy. But I didn't understand the core cause of fear. I didn't understand what was happening at the root. And the root, once you understand the root, once you understand why it's happening, then you feel more empowered and you're not so terrified by it. And so once I actually understood what was causing my fears, I became more in control of it and I wasn't so terrified by them. And so for that reason, I've created a course. You can go to transforminganxiety.com/fear or go to my bio and on Instagram and register for that course if this is something that's causing you problems. That is one of the main reasons why I wanted to focus on fear. But also, the past 2 years has really triggered people's fears and anxieties because the fear of the unknown, fear of the virus. I have a patient right now that is triggered so much on a regular basis because of her fear of germs. And of course, it's a rational fear because we keep hearing it on the news that this virus is deadly and we need to wash ourselves, we wash our hands, we need to be clean. But at the same time, when we are at that heightened level of fear all the time, we are depressing our immune system, making it more likely that we're going to get sick instead of actually staying healthy. You can do all the stuff as far as wash your hands, but if your immune system is depressed, then your defense system is down, and then this virus can have an impact on your life. But not only with the COVID, I mean, anxiety is definitely predicted to become a major issue in the coming years because this whole pandemic has definitely triggered that in people. But at the same time, it's also stopped people from living a full life because they're so afraid. I mean, fear, when it goes unchecked, can literally become debilitating, where people are afraid to leave their house. That's agoraphobia, like all these phobias that they're terrified to go outside because they're afraid to get sick. They're afraid to be judged. They're afraid to be humiliated. I used to have a terrible fear of public speaking. I used to get so nervous just even getting in front of people. And despite that, I kept pushing myself. So my goal when I was 19 of pushing myself, I kept pushing myself to do different things. So I have had all these amazing experiences because of it. But again, until I really looked at the root, I had no idea what was causing that fear and how to transform that fear into power and to make it to be more confident about it. So that's why I wanted to talk to you all about it and encourage you to just kind of really looking into your own issues and seeing how much of your life has been impacted by fear and what would your life be like if this fear did not exist.
Can you help us understand the difference between primary emotions and secondary emotions and where fear falls in to that scale? Because I think that's also helpful for people to understand how, how these emotions work. Because I know that there's, from what I recall, 8 primary emotions, but where does fear fall into that? Where does anxiety fall into that?
So we're born with 2 fears, really. It's the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. Other than that, every other fear you've accumulated over the years. And that's where it ends up getting programmed into our subconscious mind. When it's at the subconscious level, we don't have access to it unless we do the work, unless we understand how to change that. It's like having you're changing your voice message on your phone by just yelling at it and saying, I want a different message. It's not going to work. And this is why a lot of these positive affirmations aren't going to work if you're saying it, but really not committed to it. Like if I just go around and say, I'm happy, but at the core, that's not resonating with me at that level, I don't believe it, then it's not going to do anything. Normally, it takes us up to 30 days to change a pattern in our subconscious mind, but it takes work. And so but it starts with us being aware of it. Like my fear of snakes, for example, I wasn't born with that fear. That's not a core fear that I have. It's just something that I've accumulated over the years. Maybe my mom reacted to a snake, and then so I internalized that. So I have a story where recently we went to Sedona, and there was a man, and he has all these snakes. And I've seen this man before when I've gone to Sedona. I'm in Arizona, by the way. I've seen this man before, and I've always like, oh my God, I'm going to walk away from him. But then one time I went with my cousin and her daughter, who's 7 years old, and then my daughter, who's 16. And at first I was like, I don't want them to be exposed to this. But at the same time, I had to be aware that I don't want my daughter to pick up my fear of snakes. But my cousin's 7-year-old daughter ran to the snake pit and started picking up snakes like she was born doing it, had no fear of it. My daughter sees that and says, well, she's 7 and I'm 16 and I got to do this. So then she started going over there, even though at first reluctantly. By the end of it, I couldn't pull either one of them away from these snakes. And when they would bring it to me, I had to pretend to still be okay with it. I don't have a need necessarily right now to overcome my fear of snakes, but I can touch them, I can pet them, I can get near them without freaking out. But it just goes to show you that kids naturally have none of these fears. They will just go right up to something and they're fearless. But then over the years, we teach them our own anxiety. We pass all that down. I mean, some of us genetically are more disposed to anxiety, but it becomes worse over the years as we start hearing the messages, and all of that changes our programming at the subconscious level. And it becomes these patterns that we end up reenacting over and over again without consciously being aware of what we're doing. And so a lot of us just chalk it up to, and before I found out about my own anxiety, because I didn't know what was happening to me in my teens and my 20s, until I identified it as anxiety, which is fear based. Fear is at the core of anxiety. Until I made that connection, I wouldn't have known what was going on. I would have just said, well, this is just how I am. I just don't like that. I don't swim because I don't like water. I'm never going to go up on stage and speak because I don't, that's not that I'm just shy, or I don't do that. And that's what I used to say, that I'm just shy. I'm an introvert. I'm a very shy person. But I had no idea that there was something I could do about it. And that's my goal, is to have this discussion to tell you that it is totally possible to overcome these fears. I know Hosai and I did a course on marriage just a couple of months ago, and there's so much fear around relationships and about being vulnerable and how we sabotage relationships because of our fears. And so fears of past experience, fears of messing up a relationship, whatever it is, fear can impact every aspect of your life if you allow it. And that's what I wanted to focus on today, is to tell you that it's totally possible that you can overcome your fears, to be more empowered of it, and to not be debilitated and not to allow it to control you. My goal with all my patients and all my students is for you to be empowered in the face of any emotion that comes to you, and that not to feel debilitated just because it happens to show up.
I love it. I think, and that's why this discussion is so important and so relevant, because as you said, just in our own, work and dealing with different people personally, I know you, mashallah, have your own practice, but also a lot of the questions that I receive and people requesting to meet with me are actually very much centered around these types of fears. And so that's why, again, it's something that we should really explore for ourselves to understand where is the source of these fears coming from. And then also, I mean, there's two sides, again, as I mentioned in the beginning. There's the spiritual way that we can address these things, and then this way of really just naming it, understanding it, sourcing it. Where did it come from? I mean, as you were mentioning earlier, your story about water, I didn't know that story. I didn't know about your experience being thrown into the water. That's actually shocking, because I had the exact experience when I was in middle school. I was we lived in an apartment complex, and so my father had asked me to go and watch my younger brother who was swimming. We weren't allowed. The girls weren't allowed. That's a whole other discussion. But we weren't allowed to swim. My brothers were. So I don't even know how to swim, but for some reason I was put in charge of watching him. And so someone had come and pushed me into the pool, and it was the exact story. I panicked. I completely lost full control of myself. I had I just nothing. And 3 feet of water. It was a pool. It was a very small pool, but it was 3 feet. Everybody was telling me to stand up. Same exact stories. And I realized that at that point, from that point forward, anytime I was near a body of water, I just felt this crippling sense of powerlessness. And it took me a long time to get to the point where, like you said, realizing that it was because of that trauma. It was a traumatic experience. To be thrown into a situation when you're not prepared for it is very traumatic. And I had to realize that it was something that I needed to kind of rewrite for myself, because having this negative association always there in the back of my mind is kind of, for me anyway, it made me upset, because it was almost like stripping my power more. Like in that moment I felt powerless, and now forever I'm never going to be able to go into a body of water. I'm never going to be able to appreciate a beach or a pool, because that incident took away my power. So I got into that mindset that I needed to really just put my faith into action. So faith became what I leaned on. I held on to my faith, which was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with me. And if I obviously take the safety measures and protocols that I need to take to ensure that I'm not going to drown or anything, that I need to put my tawakkul in Allah. So for me, spiritual strength helped me to overcome. And my family knows, like, now I can get into a pool. I have no problem. I can go and put my feet into, walk on the beach, and I don't have the same anxieties. But it took that level of awareness, right, to understand the source of that fear, as well as to find something that gave me that empowerment. So for some people, it's going to be spiritual, and some people it's going to be maybe some behavior, changes and adjustments, or some, spiritual affirmations, as you said, or something, journaling. I mean, better in terms of what the treatments are for anxiety. But if you can, Dr. Nafisa, if you can distinguish for us the difference between just anxiety that people have, generally speaking, and disorders that are actually diagnosed, how can you tell? I mean, how does someone know if this is a general, typical, very common, sense of anxiety versus something that maybe needs more attention and that you shouldn't just brush off or kind of dismiss? If you can give us maybe some more on how to distinguish the two, that would be.
Okay, before I do that, I wanted to, I don't know if you remember or if you were with us, but when we first came to this country, we all came together, Hosai's family and my family, but we all went to Laguna Beach. I don't know if you remember this, but we ended up swimming when we didn't know how to swim. We had no business swimming in those waters. And we ended up like getting caught into like this wave. And I remember getting slammed into the rocks. And I remember being swirling around in the wave. And so that was another one that really, for me to say, I live in California. I got pushed by somebody and I didn't have any control. And then and then who knows if I'm ever going to get drowned like that again. So I defied my parents, kind of snuck around, went to my community college, took a swimming class, learned how to swim. I took action and I did something about it because I never, ever wanted to feel that powerless again. And so that was my way of taking back control of what was happening in those two incidences. And so for me, I don't think anybody would have necessarily diagnosed me with anxiety. Nobody in our family has been diagnosed with anxiety, but anxiety has definitely affected all of us at some level. And from my experience now, having had anxiety, I would be considered a high functioning anxious person. Where on the spectrum, of debilitating where I can't leave my house to having absolutely no reaction, I'm somewhere on that spectrum. I'm just not as high as somebody that's debilitated. Maybe I'm on the lower end of the spectrum. And so that's how I see it. It's not that somebody has no anxiety. I think we all have a certain level of anxiety. It's a matter of how much is it affecting you? But I know that for us, we call it so many other things besides anxiety. We might just say, oh, I'm just stressed. I'm just reactive. I'm a type A personality. I have to have my house spotless. Otherwise, I can't go to bed. But that paper has to be, every T has to be crossed, every I has to be dot before I turn it in. Otherwise, I can't live with myself. We consider those things like good qualities. Like we think that's how I am, that those are all really good things. My house looks like a model house. My closet is super organized. Those are all good qualities. The problem is society rewards all of that, which means it is a good thing. But for somebody that has an anxiety, they can't function unless that is exactly the way they want it to be. Like, for example, I know people that have dinner parties. They're like, unless my house is totally put back together, regardless of whether it's 3 or 4 in the morning, unless that happens, I am not going to be able to go to sleep. That person has anxiety. They are being controlled by anxiety. They're being controlled by the fear of shame, humiliation, being judged. And so that's what we don't understand a lot of times. So we just think, well, this is just how I am. So to be diagnosed with anxiety, a lot of people come to me, they're like, oh, I just have stress. But then I noticed that it's affecting them in a lot of different ways than just being stressed. So they have to have they might not have an idea about the level of anxiety they have. And so to be diagnosed, though, as a disorder, it has to be debilitating where you cannot function. But I've noticed, like I said, for the most part, the majority of people are somewhere on the spectrum that might be considered high functioning anxious. So they would be considered having anxiety traits. That's just the textbook and the clinical, like based on the DSM-5. But my personal experience with my patients and then also with family members and myself is that we're not always going to meet the diagnosis requirement of the DSM-5 in order to be considered an anxious person or have anxiety impacting our lives.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, just looking at the statistics, everything you said about, the fact that most of us have anxiety is actually on point, because it seems to me that I looked at some statistics earlier. In a survey in 2020, 62% of respondents reported experiencing some degree of anxiety. So that to me indicates that the majority of the people were at least aware of it. But even those who may not have reported it, like you said, if you actually dig a little deeper, they may in fact have anxiety. They just don't know to call it that because they've used other terms or ways of getting around, that label. Because that label, of course, there's stigma to it. Nobody, when we think of an anxious person, we think of someone who's walking around sort of jittery, right? I mean, that's kind of the depiction that a lot of us may have. So I think because of that negative stigma, people may not want to necessarily call it, right? Call it anxiety. So they mask it. And like you said, I'm type A, I'm this. If you're perceptive and you're actually looking out in the world and you're realizing that there are a lot of things here that are out of our control, and that, the as you said, the unknown, and there's things that we just don't have clarity about. And, just in general, like the world is a hostile place. I mean, even if those of us who are in the West and we kind of are in this quote unquote bubble, right, of the West, we still have to acknowledge that there's a lot of things that we just don't know. That's not to further induce panic. We don't want to do that, but it's more just an awareness so that we are all kind of equalized. The conversation just suddenly becomes normalized, and we're not now thinking about, okay, I don't want this label, so I'm not even going to address it. I'm just going to suppress it, but continue to live with those debilitating qualities. So I think that's why these conversations are so important, because we're bringing it out. We're defining these terms and letting everybody know that even from a spiritual perspective, because this is also another huge problem that we have to address in our community. Sometimes having any type of mental health issues is unfortunately presented as a lack of spiritual strength or like a weakness. And that is very frustrating because that's just simply not true. The shame that we sometimes associate with these terms is part of the reason why there's so many people suffering, because they don't feel empowered to come out and address these issues, to even pick up the phone and make a phone call or sign up for a class like yours. They feel weird or strange. Oh, I'm going to be labeled. But this is why we have to push back. I'm wondering, when we realize we're having anxiety or begin feeling that overwhelming fear, what should we do? I often find myself overwhelmed with anxiety about the future and am aware of the feelings not being realistic, but often feel helpless and don't know what I should do to overcome it and not feel hopeless.
Well, anxiety doesn't like uncertainty. And what's more uncertain than the future, right? And so when we have the fear of the unknown, the fear of uncertainty, not knowing what to expect, we like consistency, we like reliability, and that's how our brain calms down, because we know what to expect. The fact is that everything outside of this moment is uncertain, right? It's we don't know what's going to happen. It's unknown. But with anxiety, we have this little monster in our head that makes a huge deal out of that moment, like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And so they put it. So that's what's happening right now with the COVID and the virus, that the fear of death and dying is being triggered, fear of getting sick is being triggered, fear of the unknown and uncertainty about what's happening. And so that is bringing us in a state of panic. But understanding what's happening, because it's not just that you're afraid of the future. From what you're sounding like, your anxiety impacts other areas as well. This is the one that's probably getting the most reaction out of you. So it's a matter of really identifying what's happening. And the best way to do that is to sit with the anxiety and identify what are the thoughts that are coming up. There are usually some automatic negative thoughts that get triggered with any kind of anxiety. And because we have to change the script, but we have to first identify what is the script. What is it that we're hearing? And the best way to do that is to not only sit with it, but a lot of people that have anxiety, they want to shove it down really quickly and just completely ignore it. Well, I'm here to tell you that you are not going to get better by ignoring it and shoving it. You have to feel it to heal it. And so I want you to look at anxiety like a toddler that, if you have been around a 2-year-old, you'll see how irrational they can be about the dumbest things. I had a cousin that used to be afraid of being put on grass. And I used to go, what is wrong with her? Why is she not? Every time we would try and put her on grass, she would do all kinds of splits. She would freak out. She would not want to touch grass. And so we just thought the more we push her on that grass, she's going to overcome that fear. But she literally, it's like Hosai and I in the 3 foot of water, we had a sheer panic attack in that moment because our brain just went out of control with just being in 3 feet of water. She was the same way with that grass. And so forcing yourself into it is not going to do it. But also avoiding grass isn't going to necessarily help you deal with it, because what I've seen is, when you have an anxious mind, it's not just going to focus on one thing and then that's it, and you can avoid it and you can be good with it. It will affect other areas of your life, because that's how your brain works. You just have to kind of understand yourself and really get to know what your triggers are. You have to understand what that little monster is telling you every time. Like, for example, if I'm in 3 feet of water at that time, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to drown. I'm going to die. This is the end for me. And I have no control. Understanding whatever that language is, whatever the script is, you have to understand it first in order to be able to change it. But you're not going to just be able to change it just by beating yourself up about it and saying, stop feeling that way. That, you're being ridiculous. This is dumb. Why are you just go ahead and just jump in the water and get over it? That's not going to work, because that's going to make it's like yelling at a toddler for being afraid. You're not going to be able to get that toddler to change their behavior and get over their fear of the grass. You have to, there's a process to overcome this. Like Jose was mentioning, like fear of mustard. I knew somebody that was literally terrified of a banana because they didn't like those 3 dots in the middle. I was like, how can you be afraid of banana? But somebody that's not afraid of water could have said the same thing to me back when I was afraid of water. Or somebody that adores snakes could say the same thing about somebody that's afraid of snakes. It's just a different way of looking at it. So there's a process to overcome. Like they have these exposure therapy programs where they help you overcome your fear of heights, or get you to overcome your fear of snakes or tarantulas or whatever. What I've noticed with that is they're only thinking that the fear or the anxiety is related to one thing. But in my experience over the past 10 years, what I've realized is you can have that fear, but you generally are and you have an over anxious brain in general. And so once you overcome that specific fear, it'll morph into something else unless you go to the root and handle the anxiety at the root.
No, it was a wonderful response. Thank you. And one of the things that I have a follow up to you, if you could, one of the things that I remember reading about, which was so fascinating to me, because I love to know how the brain works, right? I love to know what is the physiological, explanation of why these things are happening. And I remember reading about the something called the amygdala hijack. And this idea that, and I'd love to hear your breakdown of it, but just briefly, that basically we have, the prefrontal cortex, right? That part of our brain that helps us make rational executive decisions. We can kind of be in that rational state of mind. And certain triggers, right? There's certain things like fear or anger or what have you that will cause this other part of our brain, the amygdala, to respond, right? And it kind of hijacks that prefrontal cortex. So I don't want to go into too much, but if you can explain that to us, because I think when you understand what's happening to your brain and you can kind of almost see it and sense it, then you have the other side of it, which is, okay, how can I reverse the effects of this, right? How can I interrupt this process from happening, right? And I know there are certain grounding techniques, but anything that you'd like or could share on this process called the amygdala hijack would be wonderful. I'd love to hear more from you.
So when we're in a state of calm, we are making rational decisions for the most part, unless your frontal lobe is like underactive. And so you're making impulsive decisions. But for the most part, when we're in a state of calm, in a state of rest and digest, in a state of healing, we're able to make rational decisions. But when something triggers our amygdala, which is the emotional center of our brain, when it triggers it, then all of a sudden the stress hormones get flooded into our body, the norepinephrine, the epinephrine, the cortisol, all of those things, the adrenaline kicks in. We're in a fight or flight. And when we're in a state of fight or flight, we are only focused on survival at that point. And that's by any means necessary, right? Because what happens when we are in a state of fight or flight, our pupils dilate, the blood gets transferred to our outer limbs, the digestion stops, our vagus nerve shuts down. We end up preparing our body to basically flee from the tiger, because we don't have time to sit there and think about what's happening to me right now. Oh, should I do this or should I do that? No, it's like get up and go, or fight, or pretend to faint and freeze. Those are the responses that we have when we're in a state of fight or flight. So we're not making decisions that are activating our frontal lobe. Everything shuts down. We go into survival mode when we're in a state of fight or flight. So imagine yourself being chased by a tiger. You can literally imagine how your body would react under those conditions. Unfortunately, our modern life is putting us in a state of fight or flight the majority of the time because of stress. It's a low grade chronic stress that we're in. And so we are making these decisions as if we're in survival mode and not in a state of calm. So the amygdala gets not necessarily hijacked, but it gets triggered. And so once that's activated, it ends up activating your memory bank. Like I don't know, if you grew up in India, for example, amongst the cobras, and those were your pets, you being thrown in a pit of cobras, you're going to be in a state of calm. You're going to be like, oh, my friends, like people that are afraid of dogs, for example. If you've never had a dog is going to make you really panic. But if you have dogs and you're like, oh, these are certain things I can do to make myself, get out of the situation. So your memory bank, you're at the subconscious level, gets triggered, it gets activated, and you're not focused in this moment. You're actually acting out patterns of your childhood and and even adulthood, or even traumas, those get kicked in. That's the hijacking. That's what's getting activated, and that's how you're reacting based on past patterns. And if you don't know the past patterns, you're not going to be able to make good decisions in the here and now. A lot of times we are doing things, we are operating the majority of the time at the subconscious level. That's just automatic pilot. That's like our programs, our computers, software program. And unless we want a different software program and we want to upgrade the software, we have to make the changes at the software level. We can't just do it by telling ourselves not to do it or to be in a state of calm. The grounding stuff, that works great in the moment, but that doesn't take care of the root cause. It'll help you breathe in, it'll help you stay calm, but you're still going to have anxiety after that moment is gone. Then you're going to have to deal with it the next time.
Right. Wow. So powerful. These are great reminders. And I hope everybody's really paying attention because, I mean, really essentially what we're talking about is, again, finding the source, the root source of these fears, really sitting with it, as Dr. Nafisa mentioned, which is, kind of in a nutshell, what we can understand is being mindful, right? Being aware of yourself, right? Unfortunately, this term mindfulness, again, kind of leads people to think of some sort of meditative practice, like, oh, you're up in, some mountain retreat and you're just being mindful. But mindfulness is really exactly what you shared throughout this conversation, which is being aware of exactly what's happening, sourcing it, sitting with it, and not running from it, because the more you run, suppress, the worse it's going to likely get for you. So really great pointers here.
So I wanted to mention that awareness is going to give you choice. That choice is going to give you a freedom and a free state of mind. Because like the person that is a perfectionist, that has to do something, otherwise they feel like they're going to get an F if they don't cross every T and dot every I, or the person that has to clean their entire house before they go to bed, they don't have a choice. They are being programmed and controlled by their anxiety and their fears. Once you have a choice, you can say, I really want my paper to look like this, but if it's not the end of the world. I want my house to look like this, but if it's not the end of the world. I'm really tired right now. I'm going to go to bed and I'm going to clean up tomorrow. That's a choice. When you feel like you don't have a choice, like I had this one lady, she's like, oh, there's no way I would ever go on vacation unless my house was totally spotless and perfect and everything was taken out and blah, 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 all that. But I was like, what would happen if you didn't? She's like, oh, I wouldn't go. I'd have to do it. Otherwise, I'd have to come back or I couldn't do it. That's when you know you don't have a choice. And that's what the awareness gives you. It gives you a choice. And once you're in that state, like even if you can bring your fear from a fight or flight to a state of neutrality, like I'm just neutral about this, then you can make better decisions on that instead of reacting and activating your fight or flight and activating the stress hormones, activating that cortisol. That is not going to help you. And that's going to actually cause, and stress is a killer. It kills people because of the response it has on the organs and on the body and the physiological impact that it can have on our body. So this is why we need to be more aware and actually have the tools and the strategies to handle it in a way that's not going to make us feel even worse by confronting it.
Wow, I love this discussion because I mean so many thoughts are coming through my mind about this whole topic, but also from a spiritual perspective, because we mentioned that when we talk about like self-regulation, right, this is also a part of it, is really being so aware of yourself that you can then control your choices, and your emotions don't control you. And that's why, again, understanding it in this frame is so essential, that we validate these things. They're just normal. We're not strange or weird or something's wrong with us for having anxieties and fears, but we also want to lean in to our rational center, lean into our faith, lean into certain things that we can do to gain control over these things so they don't control us. So really appreciate this discussion. Okay, so here's a question. How do we overcome when we know we have weaknesses on certain things and we have a fear that people will know about our weakness? For example, poor communication skills related to speaking in large audiences. So how do we address those insecurities that may cripple us and put us in a state of panic?
So basically, that is a fear response. That's a fear of being humiliated, fear of being embarrassed, fear of being judged and criticized. And that's the kind of fear that oftentimes we don't talk about. We don't talk about the inner stuff. It's easy to talk about fear of heights, fear of, snakes or whatever, but there's a lot of internal dialogue that goes on that controls us, that, oh, you shouldn't say that, that you're going to embarrass yourself, or you shouldn't do that because you're going to, there's a lot of shame, I guess, that we've accumulated over the years. The more you do exactly what it tells you to do, the more you're empowering and strengthening that fear and creating a little bully that ends up controlling you. You are basically giving the fear permission to take over and be in charge. So we all have insecurities. We all have, a fear of public speaking. I think a lot of people just have a difficult time standing up there and just being exposed and feeling vulnerable. But it's a matter of understanding what is at the root of it, and then what's the worst that can happen if you do. Even right now, I could be saying things that are a mistake or stick my foot in my mouth, but putting yourself out there, you realize, okay, well, that happened. What did I learn from it? How can I do it better the next time? Like even the fear of communication. So let's say there are certain things that you have a hard time communicating. What can you do to empower yourself so that that is no longer a debilitating issue for you? It's a matter of filling in the gaps so that the bully doesn't have a reason, like the little monster in our heads, it doesn't have a reason to criticize us and judge us. It's really our inner self-critic voice that we inherited from, maybe we were criticized too much when we were growing up and people just didn't think anything we did was good enough. So then they've probably stopped beating us up a long time ago, but we picked up that baton and we started doing it to ourselves. So how often are you beating yourself up? And for some dumb reason, we have this understanding that the harder we are on ourselves, the meaner we are on ourselves, the more productive we're going to be, and the more we're going to get things done or do better in life. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work for the same reason that it doesn't work when you yell at a toddler and make fun of them and berate them and belittle them. They're not going to do better. They're just going to learn how to do whatever you want for the moment, but they're going to end up internalizing a lot of shame and a lot of feeling like they're not good enough and they never will be good enough, a lot of self-esteem issues. So it seems like it's a self-image issue that you're struggling with. And I would work on the self-image so that, kind of like my fear of the water, I went and took action by learning how to swim. You take action by learning whatever communication skills you're lacking or whatever you feel is lacking in your life that's making you feel like you have to play the game in a small way and not fully be yourself. I hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that was so on point. And I wanted to share something to help maybe some of the people in the audience with my own experience. Growing up, Nafisa knows because we're first cousins. So in my family, I've always had an eating. I mean, not an eating, a weight issue. So I was always like the chunky one. I have very athletic siblings, and so I always had an insecurity around my weight. And I realized when I was in middle school, especially, like I had this, even though I wasn't someone who ate a lot, I think, I have some other physiological issues. But anyway, at that time, I didn't know these things. But, when people assume someone is or see someone who's, a little heavy set, there's this assumption that they just eat a lot. And that's just simply not true. There's people I know, like my whole life, I've seen people who are much thinner than me consume maybe 2 to 3 times more food than I can. I just don't eat as much, but they can do it and their metabolism works well. Whereas if I have like a cracker, I feel like I'm going to gain weight, right? So people who have insulin resistance or some other, whatever factors, they don't look quite like how they, or they don't behave the way people perceive them. But still, we assume those qualities. We assume that people, because, these are the types of things that, children especially can be so cruel. They'll use names and they'll just say all these terrible things that are just simply not true. But until you realize that there's no truth in what they're saying, right? And then you will behave in accordance with that. So I found myself, and I remember this, it's so weird how memory works, because there are so many things I cannot remember for the life of me. But for some reason, I remember this realization, I think it was in high school. that I used to have a crippling fear of being seen eating in public, because I thought, oh, here we go. Someone's going to make fun of me. They're going to look at me and go, why are you eating? Because, I'm not a human, because I'm a little heavy set, so I shouldn't eat ever. So I would never want to eat in front of people. I hated to eat in front of people. So anyway, I remember having this whole realization one day where I was like, you know what? I don't eat a lot. And if someone, makes that assumption, that is not on me, because I know myself. I know that I'm just a human. I have obviously needs. So if I need to eat something, I need to eat something. But accept this narrative that I am gorging or I am binging and I am consuming more than I need is something that I shouldn't do for myself, because then I'm behaving that way, right? But if I'm just being honest with myself and saying, nope, this is just basic, need that I'm fulfilling, then I don't have to have a shame associated with that behavior. And if someone says something to me, then I was kind of, remember, I'm in high school, so I kind of had to lean into some other tactics. But I was pretty good at responding to people. Being able to give it back, clap back, whatever you want to call it. I used to be very good at that. So I was like, I'm going to have some tools in my toolbox if someone says something to me, where I can put them in their place really quickly. And I empowered myself through language to be able to put people, in their place. And alhamdulillah, after that moment of realizing like what I was doing for so many years, I just felt very different and I felt empowered. And from that point on, nobody messed with me. Like I have a reputation, and for those who went to high school with me, they know, but they didn't mess with me because I was much more empowered and I took that shame away. I did not let people do that to me anymore because I knew my own truth. And I think that's where truth can be very empowering. So when you have an insecurity, you have to sit and say, wait a second, just because people have a perception of me doesn't mean it's true, right? If you have a fear of public speaking and you think someone is going to think you're not smart because of the way you phrase something, but you know that you are quite intelligent, then don't attribute their perception to yourself. Just be like, that's just their own limited, petty, whatever lens. I'm not going to buy it, or I'm not going to let their perception of me affect my perception of me, right? And so that's just my sort of, take on it. But I think I really remember feeling completely empowered when I had the realization that all that time I was spending believing something about myself that was simply not true. And like they say, the truth can set you free. So if that helps anybody, I hope, you go with it. Can anxiety make you freeze, like going into an interview and develop anxiety around interviewing in general? Like, is that one of the, things that can happen from being in a state of anxiety, just completely freeze?
Oh, yeah. Same with test anxiety, where you're taking a test and you end up freezing, your mind goes blank. I used to always tell people, like before I knew I had anxiety, before I connected my issues to anxiety, when people used to put me on the spot and ask me a question, especially in class, I would literally draw a blank, like nothing was going on in my head at that moment. And that's because it's like I was a deer caught in headlights. And that's because of my anxiety. Like all of a sudden I just felt like no matter what I say, because I was overthinking everything. And the same thing can happen in an interview. You're overthinking every response you're going to have, how you look, if you're fidgeting, if you're not fidgeting, if you're standing up, if you're not standing up, if you're slouching. So when you have all of those things going on in your head, especially during an interview, of course you're going to freeze. It's almost like your brain just shuts down because it's overloaded. It's overwhelmed. So the same thing happens with a lot of kids. When you overload them with all these different directions or do different things for them to do, they end up not being able to take action at all. And so for a lot of people, that's the shutdown is a regular reaction to an intense amount of stress and anxiety. But like I said, if you're having that reaction, it's probably affecting you in other ways in your life as well. What I used to do for job interviews, because I used to get so nervous about job interviews, in college, we had this program where the career center person would record you and then give you feedback as to how you come across when you're interviewing. And which was really, really helpful, because I used to think I was a nervous wreck, and then I'd watch myself on video and it didn't come across. I was like, oh, okay, well, they don't know what I'm feeling inside. So I'm just going to fake it until I make it. But at the same time, I would also, when I was looking for jobs, I would set up a bunch of interviews with places I didn't want to work at, just so I could get in that mindset and get it's like the first pancake, right? You mess up the first pancake. So if I messed up on these job interviews, it would have been okay, but I would learn from it. I would learn what not to do. I would learn how to articulate myself better. I would write my answers in a way that would make sense. I would know how to think about and organize my thoughts better just by going to these job interviews that I didn't want, just so I could get in the practice of it. So I hope that that helps you during job interviews. But then also visualizing yourself having a job interview that goes smoothly can make a huge difference. Because once you can actually see yourself doing that, then it becomes more normal the next time you find yourself on the other side, on sitting across from somebody being interviewed.
Right. And rehearsing, right? Like having some
Yeah.
practice interviews.
Yep.
Great. Okay, great. So we have another question here. How do we speak and engage with a trauma survivor who misinterprets what should be reassuring talk and gestures as subversive manipulation or attacks due to their traumatic experiences? So this is a very different question, but I guess, something that maybe you can offer in terms of how to approach people who may have present with all of these different trauma responses. How can we delicately advise them or
I
approach
think
them?
the best you can do is basically still say, it depends on your intention. Like if your intention is good and trying to be positive and supportive, that can be felt, but they could be hyper vigilant and they could be ready to attack. It's almost like cornering a wild animal that's been traumatized, right? No matter how good your intentions are of saving it, it's going to lash out because it doesn't know. You haven't created that trust with them. You haven't created that sense of consistency and reliability for their fight or flight to kind of calm down so they can actually see that you're coming from a good place. I would definitely handle them with care, and I would consistently be that trusting person, that person that consistently says the same thing, is consistently reliable with them so that they can understand, okay, this person has good intentions. Because if you, maybe it's the tone that you're using, maybe your intentions are not coming across as supportive and helpful. So I would check in with myself and see if there's anything that I'm doing to maybe trigger them. But at the same time, it's really not your responsibility when they do get triggered, because it's on them to go get help and work on that trauma so that they're not so hyper vigilant and so reactive to the help that people are trying to give them or the support that people are trying to show them.
Great. Thank you, Nafis. Okay, so there's another question here. My question is two parts. The first part is, how do I get over the anxiety I get from trying to be a perfectionist, which leads to procrastination, which then causes stress? And then my second question is, what are other ways to deal with anxiety instead of medication, or is there healthy medication that's available?
There is so many different ways that you can deal with anxiety that is not medication based. I have a whole course on that. It's called Transforming Anxiety. It's a comprehensive 6 weeks program that really gets you from like the basic step of understanding your anxiety all the way to like getting long-term control. And there's so many medications and supplements and different alternative methods that you can use. But it's not just the one thing. It's not just do this and it'll be fine, because it's a comprehensive issue that needs to be dealt with. And this is why there's a lot of videos on YouTube and online that, oh yeah, just breathe, do the square breathing and you'll be fine, or put an ice cube in your hand and you'll be fine. Like I said, all of those tactics and strategies, or even just taking a pill, is going to help you in the moment. It's not going to get to the root cause of your issues. Is why you do the things that you do. And that's my goal with my anxiety course that's available, is to really help you get to the root cause so you can have long-term management of this, to really get to the root of it, understand what's going on. And I'm not into identifying or labeling people. It's not like you have to have this label of anxiety in order to get the help, because if it's affecting you in any way, like with procrastination, which causes stress, which helps you because you're motivated by the deadline, and so that's what's making you act, and that's procrastinating. Or maybe your way of like being a perfectionist is your way of avoiding doing something, so you focus on it. It has to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. Perfectionism is an anxiety based issue because you're focusing too much on the minute details that are not necessarily important, instead of actually doing the task and getting it done and getting moving on. Like when I was doing my dissertation for my doctorate, I wanted it to be, I felt like, oh my God, this is my doctorate dissertation. It has to be perfect. This is going to be the thing that defines me. And my professor had to sit me down and say, you are not married to this dissertation. hardly anybody's ever going to read this dissertation. This is not going to be what defines you as a doctor. The rest of the work that you do, the work that you do after you graduate, is what's going to define you, not this dissertation. And so that gave me permission to let go of my need for perfection and just to get it done. A lot of times we spin our wheels because it is that fear response that gets triggered. So it's like your foot wants to push the gas pedal, but the fear wants you to push on the brake. So what happens when we push on the gas pedal and the brake at the same time? We're spinning our wheels and we're not getting anywhere. And so this has been your pattern of avoiding tasks, of not getting things done, and hiding behind it instead of just saying, you know what? Good enough is good enough. I'm just going to turn this in and I'll be okay.
Great response. And just to follow up on that, with perfectionism, I feel like it's also really important to root like where it comes from, because as you know, like in our family, there's a lot of OCD. And so if you came from a family environment where it was expected of you to be perfect, because again, that was, the standard. And if you didn't meet that standard, whatever you produced was just not considered good enough. Then you've been conditioned, right, because of that environment to have to have that high standard for yourself. And so if you can go back and try to stem where it's coming from, or maybe that's not your situation, but maybe you found that when you do things with really high, aesthetic or high standard, you get praise for it. So now you've associated this feedback, right, loop that you may comfort you in terms of just the way people treat you, the way people, invite you or welcome you. Maybe the social, circles have opened up to you because people appreciate your aesthetic. They appreciate the way you dress. They appreciate your home. So you found that there's this advantage to being that way. I think helping you to understand where it comes from is also part of managing it, because then you can go back and say, at the end of the day, and this is where from a more spiritual lens, we can also get a grip on a lot of these things, is at the end of the day, what matters the most, and how I see myself. Should I inform, or should that be based on the perceptions that other people have of me, whether it's my mom, dad, from my past experiences, or socially speaking from these different groups that I'm a part of? Should I base my view of myself based on those things, or that nobody else's perception of you matters at the end of the day? It doesn't, because there are people who are going to always have biases and always see you in the best way. Parents usually have that, right? They don't even see flaws, or other people for whatever reasons. And then there are other people who may see things again subjectively through their lens, and it's not always an accurate assessment of who you are. But sourcing where this need to be perfect, quote unquote, comes from is essential to understanding how to manage it.
Can I add something, Jose?
Yeah, please.
Okay, you were talking about your own weight issues and weight struggles, but there are people that are very skinny that are also having that need for perfectionism as well. And that need for perfectionism when it comes to weight can lead to eating disorders, where they're abusing food as far as like depriving themselves from eating. They're depriving themselves of the nutrients. I have a 11-year-old patient. Maybe she's 13 because her hormones are kicking in. Well, she will not eat because she's like, every time I eat, my stomach protrudes a little bit. And so I don't want that. So I won't eat so that I can have a hollow stomach. So it's not just in terms of turning in the right paper or looking a certain way or a house looking a certain way. It can have devastating effects. It can lead to shopping addiction. It can lead because you're spending way more than you can afford just so you can have the latest clothes, so you can look good and you have to look perfect. It can lead to eating disorders and mental health issues, and it can lead to even suicide because you just don't feel plastic surgery because you're not feeling like you're perfect enough. And the thing with perfection is you never ever will attain perfection. You're chasing something that will never ever be attained. So that's where it can cause a lot of problems in people's lives. And the eating disorder is definitely a sad thing because people end up depriving themselves of nutrients. And the thing with this girl was the less she ate, the more anxious she was, the more her homework and schoolwork was affected, the more her attitude was affected in terms of her relationships with people because she was so reactive. Her body was reacting because it wasn't getting the nutrients it needed, but her need for perfection led her to create this huge mess in her life because she thought that was the answer to be accepted and approved. And the dangerous thing is when you are thin, for example, everybody praises you like, oh my God, your figure is so amazing. How do you keep that up? So then you don't want to eat because you don't want people to stop praising you. And so the same thing, oh my God, your house is amazing. I love coming here. It's so clean and organized. So you work really hard to make sure your house is as clean and organized as possible all the time, because you don't want that sense of rejection or disapproval from other people. And that could be what you learned through growing up, or it could be what the standard of your family was. Like Hosai was saying, understanding where these fears are coming from is essential if you want to learn how to change the script and change the control that it has over you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nafisa. And also, just quickly, praise, to become slaves of praise is spiritually detrimental. And that's why we reject that. We do not do things for praise ever, because it actually can contribute to all of these, other problems. As soon as you allow yourself to just look to people to determine your own self-value, then this will open up a can of worms on you, and that you don't know where it's going to go, how far it's going to go. So that's why rejecting that, or just stopping that and looking more from a spiritual perspective to God, is so essential. Did you have a question for Dr. Nafisa?
I did. So I understand like everything she's speaking about as far as like the typical anxiety, perfectionism, and other people's criticism and everything like that. And she's given an excellent, background on it. My thing is like I have like this sort of like fear or anxiety of like what comes with like success. Like I have this thing of like because I'm ambitious and everything like that, and it's just like what can come with success is perhaps like compromising my D, and I could lose my way. And so if you could just kind of give me any feedback on that sort of anxiety, because I feel like perhaps I hold myself back from my own success, or like I'm in my own way. But that's kind of like something you didn't touch on, and I wanted to get more feedback on.
Thank you so much for the question. And a lot of people talk about fear of failure, and so we can understand that. Like, I'm so afraid to fail and not be good enough. But what people don't understand is how common fear of success is. Like everything you just said, Celine, like will this change me? Will I become too greedy? Will this make me lose who I am? Will I just end up becoming like a jerk, like a lot of these rich people are? But it all goes back to your understanding of what it means to be successful. There are people that are very successful. Like there's somebody that mentioned, like I was working with somebody that like all basically making an all or nothing statement that all people that are rich and have money are evil and horrible. And so they could sit there and say something like that, but that's black and white thinking that's related to anxiety. All or nothing. Because if we really stop and think about it, there are a lot of people now that are wealthy, but they're doing amazing things with that wealth. They have a different understanding. Like they strive to be wealthy, not for the sake of being so rich to have all these houses, but to what kind of impact can I make with this money? I know another entrepreneur that is his goal is to live a 90-10 model of being successful. Like he wants to make enough money so that he can have still an easy lifestyle for him and his family. But at the same time, he wants to live on 10% of that money and donate 90%. I love that breakdown, and that if we can have structure to our success, then we're not going to be so afraid of to get caught up on the materialistic aspect of it. Like I would have no problem being a multi-millionaire so that I can live that 90% model of donating 90% of my money in every way I can to help the environment, to help the people, to help my communities. So if you're looking at it that way, like we're getting so angry at these billionaires that are spending all their money going into space and doing that, when they could just even donate a fraction of that and they can end world hunger or whatever. That's probably your definition or your interpretation, and that's what you're afraid of. But if you have a different spin on it, like if I make money, then my impact will be greater. I will be able to help my family. I will be able to help my community and help my country or help all these people. Then that is going to be a different way of looking at success. Does that make sense, Salim?
Yes, a very redefining your whys, and so
Right.
I'll work on doing that.
Right. If your motivation is to help and to distribute your wealth, like this entrepreneur that lives on a 1090 model, he lives on 10%, but 90% of his income goes to build schools in Africa. And he donates and is very charitable. That is a much better place to be, and you're more spiritually connected, and you're working for bettering the environment and humanity, by having the money instead of being poor and being dependent on handouts and being and suffering because you feel like that's the only way that you can be in touch with your roots and in touch with and be spiritually connected and grounded.
Thank you. Beautiful questions and answers, Dr. Nafisa.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. So a person that has absolutely no fear, they are engaging in risk-taking behaviors. They're being impulsive. They're acting like they're invincible, like a teenager. Like teenagers, their frontal lobe is not fully developed, so it's the frontal lobe of their brain is underactive. So they're engaging in behaviors that are going to increase dopamine, and it's related to dopamine deficiency. So this is why taking something like Adderall or green tea extract or taking something that's a stimulant can actually help the brain engage, the frontal part activate and be more focused and make better decisions. But people that don't have that, the people that have a dopamine deficiency or that there's low activity in the frontal part of their brain, they're going to do these behaviors that look like it's fearless, but they're sensation seeking behaviors, they're excitement seeking, because that's what's going to activate the frontal part of the brain. It's for a lot of men, uh, the brain doesn't fully develop until they're 28. So a lot of men might engage in these kind of behaviors and then they finally settle down after that age. But also, for the most part, they've done studies between the difference between a man's brain and a woman's brain, where a woman's brain is 90% active at rest, where a man's brain is 70% inactive at rest. And so they are looking for sensation seeking behaviors. Like that's why they watch football and wrestling and things that are exciting, because that's activating that frontal lobe, the frontal part of their brain. So you asked what's the opposite of fear? The opposite of fear is not being fearless by doing stupid things that are going to put your life in danger. The opposite of fear is having courage. And so people that have courage, they are doing it despite having fear or despite the unknown, despite not understanding what could happen next. And that's bravery, that's having courage. It's calculated. It's not just doing dumb things like jumping off cliffs just for the sake of the excitement. Those are excitement seeking behaviors. And I hope that you can understand the difference.
I wanted to ask a question about when you're parenting, Spanla. I find that I'm a very kind of scared mom.
From what I understood, you were asking about parenting, and it's interesting you mentioned this because I was going to address it earlier and I forgot. You know, with parenting, which is a topic that I do talk about a lot, this is an issue that comes up all the time. I think most of the questions I have regarding parenting are, again, regarding things that we can't control, like the future. You want your kids to be safe, protect them. And so there's a lot of things that come up for parents looking at the world, the trajectory that we're kind of on, socially speaking. And you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? My kids, and can I safeguard them from this, that, or the other? So I think it's a natural part of parenting that we're going to have some fears and anxieties around things, again, that we can't control, right? We have to teach them. That's their rights that are owed to children, that they are educated. So education is one of the rights that children have over their parents, to be treated with respect, to be loved, right? So if you've done all of that, you've given your children a safe home environment, you've given them abundant love, you've given them quality education, and sure, teach them wealth, good things, teach them virtuous things, teach them academics, teach them character qualities. If you've done your part as a parent to do those things, and you've given them, again, other things that they need for their well-being and to thrive and survive, then what happens to them in terms of their own respective paths is not something that you should worry too much about, right? Or take on as your own fault or flaw. When it comes to protecting our kids, it's a natural instinct for parents when they're younger, right? We are really worried about their safety when they're younger.
From what little I heard, I think what she was also saying, in addition to everything you just said, is possibly passing on fears, because it sounds like she's a very fearful mom. And so maybe she's overprotective. A lot of times when we are overprotective for the sake of wanting to protect them and keep them safe, we might end up instilling fears in them. And I don't know if that's where she was going with it, but that's what triggered for me when I listened to the little bit that I heard from her. And so a lot of times we end up passing on our fears to our kids unintentionally, and we don't want to do that. Like if they come to you with creepy crawlers and bugs and whatever, don't freak out on them. Let them figure all that out on their own. Create as many opportunities so that they can feel strong and secure in themselves and that they don't end up carrying on your fears.
Any parting words, Nafisa, from you as we close out this wonderful session? I want to thank you again for opening up this discussion and for normalizing anxieties and fears for us, so that we understand not to be so hard on ourselves, but rather to seek methods of empowerment. So much of the work that you do, and I know many people have come to you over the years for treatment. And I say this not just because you're my cousin, but I know that you have actually really helped people transform their lives. I get the feedback and people thanking me all the time for how tremendous, of a support you've been for them, guidance that you've given them. So I do want to say this to everyone who's in the room. If you have struggled with fear and anxiety and you found that maybe some protocols you've taken in the past have helped you, like, here and there, but you really don't have a full grip and you seem to kind of either, God forbid, but it may be the case where things are getting worse for you, then please don't continue to just, not prioritize this and to kind of do what we said earlier, which is to just assume that it's not that big of a deal, right? Or to give it a different label that you think is more socially acceptable or less stigmatized, so that it helps you to cope with these things. Understand these things for what they are. If they're crippling you, if they're affecting you, if they're making it hard for you in your relationships, they're making it hard for you in your work, your spiritual practice, to be present as a mother, as a father, as a husband, as a wife, as a daughter, as a son. If you find that you are having a hard time functioning, right, then you need to prioritize your well-being. And this is why taking, looking into more the programs that Nafisa has, and you can give us more details about your class so that people know how to get a hold of you, how to reach out to you, and also your anxiety course, right? Because you have programs, but then you also have an entire course. So share with the audience what they options you have. Hopefully we can, put people on a path of well-being through these wonderful programs.
Okay, well, thank you, Hosai. So if any of you have other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me on Instagram. If you need to follow me or learn more about my work, just go on Instagram and learn more about the courses. And then also, if you have any questions, just message me. But I do have a full comprehensive course on anxiety, which literally is 6 months worth of therapy condensed into 6 weeks, which is online, self-paced. You can start anytime, and you have lifetime access. You can use the course to help you, help your family members. But it's really for people, because my license limits me to working only with people from Arizona and California. So because I can't directly work with people outside the states that I'm licensed in, this course gives you everything that I teach my patients with anxiety, to go at the root, to really deal with it and come at it from multiple angles so that you feel empowered and that you're no longer debilitated by it. I have a fear course that helps you get to the root of fear, that it's really teaching you what to do to understand your fear at the core so it's no longer debilitating for you. My goal is to empower my patients and my students to not be dependent on me, not be dependent on medication, not be dependent on anything but themselves, and get all the tools that they need so that they can be empowered and take on the world without feeling like they are debilitated by these emotions that can easily be controlled. They are not, just because you have them doesn't mean you can't do anything about them. And it just saddens me that so many people are suffering and allowing these fears and anxieties to limit their lives, their goals, their dreams, their choices unnecessarily, really. So if you don't have time for therapy, my anxiety course would be perfect for you. Thank you, Jose, for having this discussion. It was really fun. And I know we did go over time, but that's okay.
Thank you so much, Nafisa. Thank you, everyone, for being here. The support system is critical, and by validating these things, by speaking to them, and then putting the empowerment aspect of it, I think is really key here. Which is what I love. Every time I speak to you, Nafisa, I feel like your advice is always about really bringing people to know, to the best versions of themselves, and it's not just labels and here we're gonna medicate you and just kind of go about your business, but rather like, hey, you can overcome this. Let's do it together. I have the tools. I'll teach you. And so I really want to encourage everyone to follow up with her on that.
This discussion originally aired on the Mizan, Islam and EI Club on Clubhouse. Follow them for more enlightening discussions about mental health and spirituality. Make it a goal to work on transforming your fear for the coming year and to regain control of your life. If you're interested in learning more about my fear course, please visit transforminganxiety.com/fear. If you haven't already, you can show support for the Mental Health Break podcast by subscribing wherever you're tuning in from today. And while you're at it, feel free to give us a review or a 5-star rating, since that'll help others find the podcast. Subscribe today to get notified when new episodes drop. I want to wish you the happiest new year. May the coming year bring you health, wealth, and happiness. Looking forward to bringing you new and inspirational content next year. Bye for now.